I want to thank Jack for giving me the honor of introducing a man who actually needs no introduction to this audience. Our speaker today is Dr. Gene Sharp, a strategist and intellectual and a teacher who is known to some as the grandfather of nonviolent conflict and to others as the Karl von Clausewitz of nonviolence. He has earned these monikers through his steadfast and persistent exploration of the strategic concepts behind nonviolent action, a journey that has lasted for decades. Dr. Sharp received his bachelor's and master's degrees from Ohio State University, and I'm a fellow Buckeye, should mention, and a doctorate in political theory from Oxford University. His doctoral dissertation on nonviolent action eventually became his 3-volume opus, The Politics of Nonviolent Action, published in 1973. Prior to this work, no one had systematized nonviolent conflict. This multi-volume work was the first accessible, practical, and universally applicable treatment of nonviolent action. The theoretical framework that he developed in these volumes can be applied to anything from labor strikes to the overthrow of dictators. Many view it as the first resource that any student of nonviolent conflict should consult to understand the broad framework of nonviolent action. One of the work's most well-known contributions is Dr. Sharp's identification of 198 methods of nonviolent action, which has given direction and inspiration to activists facing oppressive opponents all over the world, as well as to academics interested in the study of nonviolent conflict. In 1983, Dr. Sharp created the Albert Einstein Institution, a think tank that is dedicated to advancing the study and the use of strategic nonviolent action in conflicts throughout the world. As senior scholar at the Albert Einstein Institution, Dr. Sharp has authored dozens of books, pamphlets, and articles about the theory and practice of nonviolent action, including, among others, his monograph, From Dictatorship to Democracy, A Conceptual Framework for Liberation, which is available in about 30 languages, and Waging Nonviolent Struggle, 20th Century Practice and 21st Century Potential, published in 2005. His most recent work, called Sharp's Dictionary of Power and Struggle, Language of Civil Resistance and Conflicts, will be released in October with Oxford University Press, and I, for one, have already pre-ordered my copy. As a teacher, Gene Sharp is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. He's held numerous research appointments at Harvard University, as well as teaching or research positions at many other institutions. His contributions have been recognized by the Manhattan College, which awarded him an honorary doctorate in laws in 1983, as well as by Rivier College, which awarded him an honorary doctorate of humanitarian service, and Ohio State University, which gave him an Alumni Association Professional Achievement Award. Very briefly, Jack asked me to speak to Dr. Sharp's influence on research in the field. I will speak for myself. When Maria Stephan and I published our article, Why Civil Resistance Works, in 2008, the editor of the journal International Security, whose name is Steve Miller, told me how convinced he was by the case we made. Although he was an expert on nuclear proliferation, Steve was familiar with Dr. Sharp's work, having been a young student at Harvard when Dr. Sharp was a fellow at the Center for International Affairs, working on the concept of civilian-based defense. Steve said that although he had been a skeptic at the time, our 2008 article seemed to vindicate the work that Gene Sharp had been doing all along. It is true that ultimately Dr. Sharp and his intellectual successors really did the heavy lifting long before Maria and I came onto the scene, and she and I had the relatively simple task of subjecting these theoretical ideas to our empirical tests. I have been heartened to observe that in recent months, Dr. Sharp is actually getting the attention he has long deserved for his patient commitment to getting theories of nonviolent conflict right. His work continues to inspire me and many others. In 2009, with the support of ICNC, I launched a project that explores how activists put his methods of nonviolent action to work on a daily basis and their struggles. Through this knowledge-gathering exercise, researchers like myself can look at patterns in the sequencing and intensity of tactical choices that activists like you make so that we can better understand how resistors can create change in their intolerable situations. So as you can see, I can confidently say for myself that I would not be where I am in my research, my career, or indeed in my life without his intellectual inspiration. That is why it is my great pleasure to introduce him to you this afternoon. Please help me to welcome Dr. Gene Sharp.
I put together a few thoughts to share with you in light of the situation in the world today. Because violence in our world is so common and so mostly accepted axiomatically that it seems overwhelming and a permanent part of social and political reality. Those of us who want the future to be different are mostly relegated to the role of irrelevant objectors, able only to dissent, unable to achieve a fundamental shift away from the spreading role of violence in political reality. This situation can lead us to accept that reliance on selective and massive violence is inevitable and beyond our influence and control. But that conclusion is a grave error and is not based on the actual full reality. True, violence seems to be everywhere, but it is not. During the past century, and long before, people at times have found another way to fight when they needed to fight. In these limited situations, the violence shrank or disappeared because it was no longer needed. This was nonviolent struggle, or at least a primitive forerunner of what we know as nonviolent struggle today. There's no date for the invention of this technique, and no name of an inventor, and clearly it was not Gandhi. Amazingly, there was a time when the method of the labor strike had to be learned. Sometimes people knew enough to apply some nonviolent methods, such as economic sanctions, effectively, as did the American colonists, but they did not know how a nonviolent way to confront British troops. People have used this different way to wage conflicts with modest but not amazing effectiveness. They had limited knowledge and understanding. There were no guidebooks on planning strategy, or even a list of do's and don'ts. Despite this underdeveloped technique was recognized to have enough advantages over the violent option to be chosen and applied in some important conflicts. Strikes and economic boycotts provided working people with the needed pressures to improve their economic situations. General strikes in some European countries, as in Sweden, won the vote for all men in their elections. Repeated demonstrations, protests, and often prison sentences brought the vote to women in Britain and the United States. Nonviolent colonial rebellions in several countries ended the claims of ownership by European countries over much of the rest of the world. Civil rights struggles continued the fight for equal treatment. Nonviolent struggles were waged in Nazi-occupied Denmark and Norway, and elsewhere, and even in Berlin to save Jews. It was once thought that the peoples of Eastern and Central Europe would be living under communist rule minimally for decades, barring a Western military intervention. Now, the peoples of Poland, East Germany, the former Czechoslovakia, and elsewhere are recognized as having freed themselves without a war of liberation. Perhaps most remarkably, of all these cases, the little nations of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, who had fought brave guerrilla wars against Nazi occupations and against Soviet incorporation of those nations within the Soviet Union. They're not merely as an occupied country as Poland, but within the Soviet Union itself. They had been annexed, and yet following their own methods of nonviolent revolution in what was called the Singing Revolution, and the strategic understanding gained from the new book, Civilian-Based Defense, they exited the Soviet Union, opposing both the KGB and the Soviet occupation army. And their brave small populations suffered lost lives of only 12 in Lithuania, 8 in Latvia, and none in Estonia. Compare these with the massive loss of lives in the brave but failed violent struggles in Chechnya. Reality used to be understood to mean that military means are effective and quick, and that nonviolent means are weak and irrelevant. In the Soviet Union itself, the hardline coup d'etat to stop the liberalization launched by Gorbachev was blocked by significant protests and non-cooperation. The significance of the defeat of the attempted coup was explained away by some of our sophisticated commentators as poorly organized, as though the heads of the Communist Party, the Soviet Army, and the KGB knew nothing about organizations. And now we're in a different situation. The failures and limitations of military means and the demonstrations of the power of nonviolent struggle are most probably more than these few citations I've offered. These, however, are sufficient to demonstrate that the world is changing. The new awareness of the power of this technique appears to be spreading. It also appears to be accompanied by a recognition of the need for information. This is fueling an increased demand for resources and writings. The new awareness is not enough, and on its own will not necessarily lead to effective action. Between the awareness and the action is an important step, in-depth understanding of how this technique operates. That understanding can greatly contribute to increased capacity to develop an effective plan for liberation. That itself can greatly increase the chances of success. New books and booklets are revealing a technique of great power and have provided important views and insights into its history. Historical films have made past struggles alive again. An experienced military officer, that is Robert Helvy's examination of strategic nonviolent struggle, is accepted as must-reading by people in serious crises. A generic examination of how nonviolent struggle could destroy a dictatorship is with virtually no promotion, now in 34 languages, and 15 more translations are in process, despite the Albert Einstein Institution's very strict procedures for translations. Group tutoring and guidance for nonviolent organizing and for discipline are offered by several significant groups. There is now even a guide to help groups to become competent to plan their own strategies. People used to come to us and ask us, what should they do? We refuse to tell them. And that corresponds with a group from Syria, actually. It worked yet over a couple of years, has now been worked together and massaged and developed into the new booklet, Selfliberation, with the subtitle, A Guide to Strategic Planning for Action to End a Dictatorship or Other Oppression. This booklet and all the 900 pages in English and Mandarin are available on the website of the Albert Einstein Institution, www.einstein.org, for download. And other translations of everything are in process. Additional translations in process, downloads for other items on nonviolent struggle from websites are at times so large that in certain countries it is tempting to predict, for example, a major nonviolent uprising in Vietnam, if we were more modest. When a California public radio station very briefly offered a free hardback copy of Waging Nonviolent Struggle, the publisher needed to reprint it, simply to have enough copies to distribute. Major books by the author of books that someone has said nobody ever reads are exhausting a warehouse supplies and raising the need for reprinting. The Arab Spring and other developments suggest that the genie is out of the bottle and cannot be put back again. The knowledge of how to cast off oppression nonviolently is now known and is spreading despite problems, and certainly there are problems. But that knowledge can never be wiped out completely from human consciousness. Of course, there will be problems, reversals, and mistakes. However, the thought barrier to which Commander Sir Stephen King Hall in Britain referred in 1957, as he encountered skepticism when he called for a royal commission to examine the possibility of providing national defense by nonviolent resistance, that thought barrier is now broken. The 6 weeks media frenzy at the Albert Einstein Institution about nonviolent struggle in March and April consisted of 5 days a week, 4 to 7 interviews a day, consistently. These interviews revealed an amazing and new quality. Those dozens of reporters from various countries, for print press, radio, and television, all arrived with an accurate, basic understanding of nonviolent struggle. And that is new. That is very new. And their editors who made these assignments anticipated their readers and listeners and viewers wanted to know this new information. And that is new. The world, she is a-changing. None of them had the old understandings and false preconceptions that were universal in past years. Their editors must have reasoned and thought our readers and viewers will want to know this. So it's worth the trip to Boston to get it with a telephone call. About this new phenomenon, the media attention now continues, but at a slower and slightly more civilized rate, because that was very exhausting. But something has changed. Another personal note, which has already been mentioned, my new highly unorthodox dictionary, which contains 994 entries and 825 defined terms, challenges these dictionary terms challenge the pro-violence biases of our language about power and defense. It covers nonviolent struggle, dictatorship, oppression, social change, popular power, liberation, sociological analysis, and political theory terms. And it's to be published by Oxford University Press, no less, November 1. And this title is not of my also original choosing. I don't do things like that. It's being called Sharp's Dictionary of Power and Struggle, Terminology of Civil Resistance and Conflicts. The world, she is changing. And maybe they put the word Sharps up there to dissociate themselves as not being responsible. Major advances have now been made in recent years in the knowledge and understanding and the practice of nonviolent struggle. We are beginning to learn how achievements of past struggles have been possible. Sometimes the advances have been made despite the political blindness of officials and the cruelty of government. Many people have seemed unable to see the reality and capacity of this kind of power. This people power employs psychological, social, economic, and political weapons, in quotation marks if you like, all nonviolent. Nevertheless, many officials and almost all governments retain their irrational faith in the omnipotence of violence, and therefore drag their societies and people into disasters. Also, some would-be revolutionaries of the past, such as Lenin and Mao, accepted the supposed basic truth of the very societies they rejected, that violence is the necessary source of power. That led to new disasters. We now know that the disasters caused by violence and political conflicts are not inevitable. Much too slowly it is being understood that power in political conflicts is derived from identifiable sources. And all of these sources are rooted in the obedience and cooperation and assistance of people and their institutions. We now realize we know where the power comes from, that at crucial times in human history, the obedience and assistance needed have been restricted, and that restriction has weakened the forces capable of imposing oppression and injustice. When that obedience and assistance has been not weakened but severed, the necessary sources of political power are cut off. The dictatorship or other system of oppression dies then of political starvation. Violence against that system to liberate oppressed people is not needed. Case after case of successful struggles in difficult circumstances have already moved nonviolent struggle well beyond Gandhi and King. These cases demonstrate that nonviolent struggles are realistic and that they can be successful in a violent world. There was a time when it was widely thought that nonviolent struggles required a charismatic leader, a Mahatma, to be successful. We now know that is not true. Dependence on such a leader can even be a liability and a weakness. There was also a time when it was widely thought that nonviolent struggle only works by conversion, melting the heart of even a Hitler, as Milton Mayer once argued. We now know, at least since the politics of nonviolent action, and since the disintegration of ruthless regimes by defiant people, the nonviolent people can be much more powerful. There was a time when it was believed that in order to keep nonviolent discipline, it was necessary to be committed to moral nonviolence or pacifism. We now know that hundreds of thousands, even millions of people can keep reasonable nonviolent discipline without a belief in moral nonviolence, as Egypt, for example. There was a time when it was widely thought that a wise course of action could only be charted by a single strategic genius, such as Mohandas Gandhi. We now know that regular people, as the so-called ordinary people used to be the term, can create a wise and competent strategy for their self-liberation. We can reflect on the remarkable changes in the status of nonviolent struggle in the world over recent decades. Nonviolent struggle was once closely identified with Mohandas K. Gandhi, and it was also often assumed that a new Gandhi would be required in the future. That clearly is not true anymore. Major struggles involving millions of people now occur where there's no easily identified leader. The growing capacity of nonviolent struggle never produces miracles, but it can produce more successes. These successes need to be handled wisely so they can contribute to reducing oppression and empowering the formerly oppressed people. Hard-won gains achieved by nonviolent struggle must not be permitted later to be stolen. That can happen either by incremental attacks, as appears to be happening in Egypt, or by future executive usurpations or coup d'etat, as happened by the Bolsheviks in Russia in 1917 and by the Ayatollahs in Iran in 1979. The sole available guide to blocking such takeovers is provided by the Anti-Coup by Bruce Jenkins and myself. It's important that the achievements of this struggle be accurately recorded so the nation's history is remembered and not forgot or misrepresented, as so often happens country after country after the immediate crisis is gone. Major advances have now been made in the knowledge, understanding, and practice of nonviolent struggle. At an advanced stage of a nonviolent struggle to undermine a dictatorship, dangerous foreign military intervention is possible. Foreign military intervention can occur in two ways. Regional intervention to restore peace, in quotation marks, as may actually be motivated by an aim to remove the example of how to achieve greater freedom and justice. Other people should not be learning from that case, so you can put a stop to it. The intervening government may not want its own people to learn by example. Other external governments may intervene because they are claimed to be shocked by the brutalities of the targeted regime. They may not understand that brutalities are to be expected from an oppressive government when their control is seriously threatened. The same governments are not shocked by the human costs of military conflict. If the original resistors expected that military assistance would bring speedy liberation with reduced casualties, they may now learn that neither may be the case, as in Libya this year. Any external military intervention brings a strong risk of later intervention to serve the interests, economic, political, and military of the intervening government. It was once thought that violence works quickly and that nonviolent struggle takes forever. I don't know how many times I heard that over the years. The events in Tunisia and Egypt, compared to Libya, have shown that belief to be false. Dangers in the practice of nonviolent struggle remain, of course. Repressive governments are now often well aware of the threat to their domination that is posed by people who want to be free and who use nonviolent struggle to gain their freedom. Governments should, therefore, be more careful in their responses to nonviolent struggles. Oppressive rulers can be expected to behave more desperately and brutally when threatened. Sometimes autocratic rulers openly admit their fear, the fear of the spread of this knowledge of nonviolent liberation. We need to remember that fear rarely produces wisdom. Oppressed peoples may seem to be more able to learn new ways than their oppressors learn, new ways to become determined, self-confident, and empowered to achieve freedom. The current condition at times can be one of confusion and dangers. It can also be a condition of growing empowerment, freedom and justice, and ultimately of reduced violence. A future of domination, the rule of violence, and popular helplessness need not be inevitable. We now have the knowledge needed to block that future, if we have the will to use it, to block the installation of new dictatorships. When a new nonviolent struggle movement is becoming very strong, it would be wise to beware of the peacemakers, intervening governments purporting to aim to restore peace. It may be a regional group, a military alliance, an international treaty organization, or a sole superpower. In such a case, restoring peace likely will mean helping the oppressive regime to survive. That is the same oppressive regime that the struggle movement has targeted for dismantling. The alternative to cooperating with such interventions is for the struggle movement to intensify its efforts to paralyze the oppressive regime. Self-reliant struggle tends to keep control of the conflict more in the hands of the people who are most concerned with the issues in the conflict. Much has been learned about the nature and potential of nonviolent struggle. However, there's still much to be learned. We are at a new stage in the historical practice and potential of nonviolent struggle. If we are at a new stage in this historical practice and potential, if we take wise and responsible steps in the coming months and years, the future can reveal achievements beyond our present abilities to imagine them.
Tim from Burma. I've met you already. My question is, if you look at this nonviolent principles or movement as a whole, and your name is pretty much everywhere, and I was just wondering, it's a bit of sort of like a personal, sort of like a question as well, in terms of how much have you sort of like not realized it, kind of like sink in terms of your influence in this movement, and how does it impact you as a person, as a human being, that all the things that we're doing here is somehow, along the way that connected with you or coming from you?
Well, sometimes I'm quite sure I'm receiving more credit than I deserve. For example, it's been said my writings had a major influence in Egypt and later maybe in Tunisia. I don't know that. We don't have the evidence that really documents that foolproof. some influence generally, perhaps, but specifically, I don't know. In any case, it's the people who did the struggles that deserve the work. To the degree that my writings have been helpful, it means those years, and there were years, not weeks, of research and thinking and drafting and redrafting and revising and changing my mind and changing the thinking. All those difficulties have been worth the effort. Some people are so eager to get quick results, especially Americans, you know. And quick results aren't necessarily sound results. But I hope that the little bit that's been opened now, what I described, it's a big thing that's been opened. But that's only a little bit compared to what can be opened. That in the future needs the support and effort and evaluation. And maybe some people change their minds, you know. It all needs to be thought through. I don't want people to read my books as some new kind of thing they're supposed to memorize and cite verses and chapters and nonsense like that, you know. But to learn what questions does that now raise? What old understandings now have to be revised? And what will have to be revised in the future?
Dr. J. Michel. In your book, From Dictatorship to Democracy, you mentioned that you traveled to China in 1989 to witness the ongoing event. I'm very curious about that because in your book it's just a single sentence. Can you say something more about it?
Yes, Bruce Jenkins and I went there with a translator from the Albert Einstein Institution to learn why the Chinese students had chosen to use nonviolent means. We did not go there to lecture. We did not go there to teach. We did not go there to advise, but to learn. Sometimes I must admit, maybe we should have offered a little suggestion, but we didn't do that. And so we did a lot of tape recordings of interviews with quite a number of people from different student groups were there, and we were able to learn quite a bit. We learned that they knew something about nonviolent struggle, but nothing in depth. They knew something about the civil rights movement. They certainly knew something about Gandhi. They knew something about continuing civil rights protests in the United States. And they cited certain things in Chinese history occasionally, not often. But that was it.
I'm Konstantin from Ukraine. I wanted to ask you, based on experience of my country, what do you think, what is your advice for the nonviolent activists? What would be the best strategy after the victory? How to maintain the better what was achieved and not to lose it and not to disappoint the other movements after the victory is achieved? Ukraine.
I'm not well enough informed on Ukraine. You should probably be able to answer that question yourself. You know, you have to watch what's going on. You have to try to make the democratic ways of acting as strong and as competent and well conducted as possible, so they have a good public audience. You know what's going on. But we watch for their efforts to whittle away. If there's any effort to control elections again, you know, if there's any efforts to censorship political opinions and conduct struggles on those terms, there will be help. If there's I haven't heard there's any chance of a coup d'etat in Ukraine, But if there ever is, now sometimes by elected officials, it happens in some countries, not always outsiders from the military. Like that we have this one book, which is not available in Ukrainian.
First, thank you for coming and speaking with us. It's an honor to meet you and hear you speak. My question is, we spent a lot of time this week talking not just about strategic nonviolence, but also sometimes talking about violence and the allure of violence. And one thing that I don't think has really been brought up is that the use of violence and waging a conflict can be quite profitable for those who are involved in that conflict. You buy the missiles, the planes, the ships, you make a lot of money off that, blow up some other country or some other place, you get paid to rebuild it, all those things. So my question is it possible for nonviolent movements to create that type of profit themselves, or wage their struggle in a way that profit that would normally come through violent means is no longer there, is no longer profitable, or is no longer a kind of profit that those who wage violent struggle want to have anymore? So how do we make violent struggle not profitable and nonviolent struggle more profitable?
Can you make this the topic of your next research project? I'm serious. I don't have automatic plans for solving all of these particular elements. The objective of mine, going back a long time. Oops. Oh, nothing. My objective has been not to do all the research that's needed myself, which would be a silly objective, because it could never be done, but to open up the field to a whole series of questions, some of which I knew what some of the topics would be, and some of them I had no idea what would be needed to investigate in the future. So that is a topic that's very important. As you figure, what is going to be involved in costs? Say you want to train all the people in the United States in non-cooperation and defiance for national defense against a Canadian invasion or a Mexican invasion. And how would you use the educational materials, all the printing of those books, and holding of classes, and hiring of teachers, and preparing of video games, and what's this all going to cost? And it won't go up to what the profits made on war, but put some people to work that are now unemployed. But I would encourage you to work on that problem. Even if you only get as far as outlining some of the elements of that solution, that would be an improvement over the present lack of knowledge and understanding.
Dr. Sharp, I'm Ghada from Egypt. I have to tell you that while we were on Tahrir, your writings were being circulated in Arabic. And many of the people on Tahrir wanted to be included as the laughing revolution. And we claim that we laughed our president out of his post. But alongside that, there were many allegations that your writings were filtered to Egypt through security institutions. Have you heard any of that?
No.
It was even cited in some BBC coverage.
My writings were censored in Arabic.
No, that they were they were widely circulated in Arabic over the past few years, in coffee shops and in bars,
including especially by the Muslim Brotherhood.
And by other groups, and by Kifaya and the 6th of April movement. They were widely circulated over the past few years. And during the Tahrir sit-in, there's even a story in BBC about people sitting under tanks and reading Sharp's writings. And as I told you, Egyptians... American-made tanks.
And one Abrams.
And Egyptians want to earn their place in your writings as being the laughing, humorous revolution. And if you go through the placards we held and the jokes we cracked, maybe we qualify for being the most humorous. But as I told you, alongside that, there were allegations that some security apparatus from the United States was behind the widespread sharp discourse in Egypt. How would you find that?
Humorous?
I have to tell you that you were present in Tahrir.
Well, I refuse to speak to Jamil Hakim because we've heard things that are in lots of reports, but they are in platitudes and generalizations and no concrete information. And we've been rightly or wrongly, I think rightly, been very cautious about claiming credits. For example, we did have a major influence in Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, along with their own improvised and spontaneous developments of using non-violent protests. But the page proofs for the Princeton book, their civilian-based defense, were used by the independence-minded governments in those three countries in planning their exiting from the Soviet Union. Now, we were doing so little claiming of credit that when we published, for example, a book on Lithuania and on Latvia, we did not include in those, maybe there's no mention or a tiny mention only of some influence there. Our influence was actually quite strong in those three countries, but we didn't claim credit, you see. And sometimes just for the accurate historical record, it needs to know, because I think that if you can combine people's intuitions and self-reliant development of these ideas with hard evidence from research in the past and strategic understanding of what could be done in the new situation, which can come from printed material, that is a tremendous combination and can be very helpful. Yeah, but we had so little. If we had support from a U.S. intelligence agency or otherwise, you know, if there's a few of you who've been to our office, and some people come in and they've almost been laughing, you know. They think there's this big suite of offices with a staff of dozens of people, you know, with worldwide agents all over the place, you know, and they come to a little office of 2 crowded rooms, you know, and sometimes 2 people only in the staff, and then maybe 3 now, you know. And we had people came from Moscow one time for interviewing, and they had far more people doing the interviewing and filming for television, Russian television, than we had staff in the office. You know, it was quite humorous, you know.
And they must be misers, these intelligence.
But please be in touch with Jimmy Leberkibi if you're not already.
I'm also from Egypt, and I would want to disagree with Ghada on the fact that your works were widely circulated. They were limited, available in limited and in almost individual quantities. It's true that on the other hand, there were claims that this was that Gene Sharp is associated with the CIA, and that this is somehow used to discredit whatever the Egyptians had achieved. That being said, I mean that's a whole. It's been the subject of a narrative now. You know, the radical left aligns with the people in the government that use that claim to discredit the revolution, and but that's the subject of another topic. I think the question which you raised is very interesting regarding the fact that having a leader can be a liability. Mohandas Gandhi. Now, the Egyptian revolution, we called it a leaderless revolution. At this stage, and right now, though, that plus becomes somewhat of a liability. How do you see the Egyptian revolution at this stage, and in some respects Tunis as well?
From a distance? That's not a joke, really. It's quite serious. I can only see what's happening now from a great distance with accurate information of what's happening there not being available. And I'm busy doing 304 other things, you know. So I can't know enough to offer an important opinion. In any case, as an outsider, I should not be telling or pretending to tell people of that country what to do, except be damn careful. That's your job.
Well, what about having a leaderless revolution? I mean, at this stage where it's nonviolent and it's leaderless, and then it doesn't seize power. It's some other entity that has seized power. That's, in fact, was the heart. You know, was actually the heart of the old regime. How do we? Yeah, the top echelons of the army. Yeah. So.
But that was built into Mubarak's leaving. He left on condition that the military forces would come in as a provisional government. That was a condition of his leaving. Now, first of all, you don't have to get a dictator's give to the dictator his conditions for him to leave. You take the power away. But that was the present role of the military was in Mubarak's conditions for leaving. He put it there, and the opposition accepted it. And that's a lesson for some of the rest of you in the future. A dictator can be removed from power by taking all the power away. Milosevic was not in the position to impose what new potential ruler would be the case in Serbia. Milosevic had no more power left. That's the nature of nonviolent struggle. You take all the power away which is not deserved, which has not been earned. And more than that, no way. And then prepare for the post-struggle situation. Usually people have no time or intention of preparing for the post-struggle situation. For those of you who haven't had your successes yet, beware that after you bring down the existing regime in your country, there's going to be a period of great danger, great uncertainty. You don't want chaos. You don't want massive slaughters on the streets. You don't want a repetition of the Hindu-Muslim conflicts that happened in India with thousands and thousands killed. You don't want any of that. That will cause people to want to have the old regime back. So you have to plan how are you going to deal with that transition period and think how to do that well in advance. And have good, solid plans. And distribute in advance all the knowledge that's necessary to prevent a coup d'etat by somebody, whether it's a CIA-organized coup d'etat, whether it's a military-organized or intelligence agency coup d'etat, or whatever. Or just another group who believe they have the total truth.
Hi, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm actually in the military. I skipped my National Guard drill weekend this past weekend to come here. And I'm a conscientious objector like you. And I joined the military because I thought, I've always been taught that war is the only realistic means to achieving peace and liberation, but having come back from war and becoming so disenchanted with it, it was rehabilitated to come across your work because it showed that nonviolence is strategically and tactically more sophisticated than warfare has ever been or could ever be. So thank you for that. My question is, at what point do you draw the limitations of what nonviolence can achieve, and and use violence either as a primary tool or as a complementary tool. For example, in Afghanistan, some would argue that it's necessary to maintain a military presence to protect civic institutions. Would you agree with?
No, and again, I don't know Afghanistan in depth. I learned some things through contacts and friends recently. But the question, the way you pose the question is one I've heard a long time ago. What are the limits? Well, now I can only do this much. It can't do that much. And then the next month we discover that it doesn't do it. Well, it has done that much, you know. But so I've never focused on answering that question. What can it not do? I focus on what it has done, and therefore could probably do this at least that much in the future, and how much could we push back that barrier of impossibility. And if we can't push back the barrier of possibility, then the violence will be used, and that will be out of my control. But if we can keep pushing it back and revealing that nonviolent struggle can do much more than was ever expected, then pretty soon there'll be almost nothing left for violence. You know, that's my approach anyhow, biographically.